So you want to hear a story, huh? One of the treacherous world of game development. Have I got the one for you? While today, Borderlands is synonymous with a colorful art style and a million billion guns, it wasn't always going to be that way. During development, Gearbox Software's new flagship looked entirely different, falling in line with the same brown and gray style of the time before an internal mutiny brought on its dramatic change. This is the story of how Borderlands got its iconic art style, how it rebelled against the RPGs of its time to stand out, and the last-minute choices that turned the game into the franchise starter it would become. This is the Borderlands that almost was.
Time to gather up your stuff! Who's getting off the bus?
As far back as the studio's founding, the idea for the game that would become Borderlands had been rattling around Gearbox Software. Studio head Randy Pitchford saw the idea as a combination of his two most played games, Doom and NetHack. For those who were a bit younger at the studio, the idea was instead Halo meets Diablo, but everyone internally agreed that this was their dream game, combining the addicting loot loop of an RPG with the visceral action of a shooter. It wouldn't be until almost 6 years later that the earliest plans would be put into motion. Following work on the Half-Life expansion Opposing Force, the start of their own franchise Brothers in Arms, and fittingly the PC port of the first Halo, a team of about 12 would be siloed off to begin prototypes. Internally, something that was half Halo pointed to this project being some form of science fiction, and was the first real opportunity to show what the studio could do from a world-building perspective. But something, quote, science fiction was a bit of a moving target, so the team would begin focus testing internally to iron out the style, offering mood boards with a wide range of aesthetic inspirations from a high sci-fi look akin to Mass Effect to a more grounded anime cyberpunk look, before settling on something a bit more dirty, inspired in part by the improvised used future aesthetic of Star Wars. Realistic yet retro. It was fitting then that when the studio would part ways with an unnamed art director, the team would turn to the iconic work of Ron Cobb to develop concept art. Cobb, whose work included everything from the original design of the DeLorean from Back to the Future to the Flying Wing in Raiders of the Lost Ark, was a perfect fit for this rough-around-the-edges look. That being said, despite the pedigree behind it, Borderlands was very much a gray and gritty game of the era, with some developers referring to it as, quote, a poor man's Rage, with nothing truly special to separate it from the competition. I do think Rage is a fair point of comparison. While it feels somewhat forgotten to time nowadays, despite its sequel in 2019, the idea of a new single-word title id game on the horizon being your direct competition does give some pause, even if it would be eventually delayed past Borderlands' release. As development continued, however, there was an ever-swinging pendulum and near-constant debate on what Borderlands was. While there had been proto-looter shooters, a phrase that really didn't enter popularity pre-Destiny, and games like Hellgate London, what exactly a first-person RPG looked like was closer to the immersive sims of the era and whatever Bethesda was working on. Pre-Fallout 3, there really wasn't a lot of shooting. Gearbox, however, with their background, found that pendulum was swinging towards shooting, but it wasn't nearly as over-the-top as the finished game. In 2007, following about 20 months of work, the team at Gearbox would strike a deal with 2K for publishing and take their promising prototype to the Leipzig Games Convention for a closed-door demo. While it is unclear what exactly was shown, articles from the time tell of a segment in New Haven narrated by Helena Pierce and point to the obvious Mad Max influence. By all accounts, it looked impressive, and at the conference, Game Informer would offer to put Borderlands on the cover of their September issue, giving the public the first look at what it was going to be.
If you're enjoying your evening at Luxtat Cinemas, please consider subscribing.
7 years ago, the corporations of the galaxy journeyed towards the supposedly mineral-rich ice planet of Pandora, with countless colonists hoping for new opportunities and an army of criminals forced into slave labor to help build it. When the planet thaws after a decade-long winter, however, it turns out there isn't anything of actual value here, except angry monsters hungry from extended hibernation and alien ruins that point to some lost vault. Everyone who can afford it leaves, and the entire planet descends into lawlessness, with those that aren't criminals just barely scraping by. Game Informer's article and what we know of Borderlands at this time seems surprisingly focused on the history of Pandora. As mentioned before, Gearbox hadn't had a lot of opportunities for world building like this, and you can see, even from other interviews with Randy Pitchford at the time, that they're particularly enthusiastic to talk about lore as much as shooting. In that way, the influence of the role-playing genre is still apparent, It'll be a trend with the rest of this article, but as development went on, a lot of this was refined or cut down, still mostly existing in audio logs from both Helena Pierce and Tanis, but not much more than that. That being said, a lot of the core Borderlands experience is still here. Developers emphasize that it is more of a shooter than RPG, rather than something like Fallout 3 or Mass Effect, and the goal is still to encourage a feeling of one more quest to the player, offering an addictive gameplay loop. However, there's quite a bit that wouldn't make it to release. For one, the world of Pandora itself seemed to be as randomized as the weapons. This does come clearly from the Diablo influence with its procedural dungeons, but also reminds me at least of Randy Pitchford referencing NetHack as a touchpoint, as it was an early successor to Rogue where the term roguelike gets its name. I am surprised to see that these changing dungeons made it this far, however, as another Game Informer interview after release implies that making dungeons like this was cut early on in development. Similarly, the team at Gearbox emphasizes that Borderlands will have no load screens, which just isn't true. It for sure makes sense with the hardware limitations of the time. I'm not holding it against the final game or anything, and it was pretty common for other games in the genre, like the obvious load screens of Fallout New Vegas' Freeside, or less obvious ones like Mass Effect's Countless Doors. It's honestly a hard thing to unsee in a time where solid-state drives and the like are common, but still it's interesting to read about a Borderlands that's this technically ambitious. In this article, there was also only 3 playable characters, with the demo showed for the cover story focusing primarily on an early version of Roland and Mordecai. Brick in his more over-the-top style was yet to be added to the game, and Lilith's design seemed much more similar to what you would see in a D&D sourcebook than something in a gritty sci-fi shooter. While 4-player co-op was still a thing, Gearbox intended for there to always be repeating characters. They didn't want players to not play together or not carry over their progress from single player because both were playing the same class. Some of the clone army look, as they put it, would have been mitigated by changeable armor, similar to what was seen in something like Oblivion, with things like gloves acting as grenade mods. I'm curious if this was cut because of the challenge of redesigning all of those assets into a new art style, or because it felt sort of redundant, less streamlined, and more RPG-esque. I'm inclined to think it was the latter, as when the game would be shown off of the following E3 pre-style change, both characters are their standard appearance, and Randy only makes an offhanded reference to it.
That guy's got an orb shield. He's tough. He's also got a helmet.
Still, it's an interesting way to look at how Borderlands could have more closely resembled its RPG contemporaries. Despite this focus on co-op, Borderlands was also designed with single player in mind as well, with the added benefit of AI companions that you could hire and give orders to with simple squad commands. It's a little unclear if these are just generic characters or the other classes you didn't choose, but the way the demo describes letting Mordecai drive and him off sniping independently with no mention of a second player, it feels like this might be the case. In the past, I've sort of pictured something similar to Marvel's Ultimate Alliance games, where you're always on a team of 4, but can give commands to the other heroes you're not currently playing as. It's hard to say. All in all though, this is an impressive look at what Borderlands could have been, and it really does seem like Gearbox had something special, part Mad Max and part Indiana Jones, while also being part Halo and part Diablo. With that boost, the team would continue building on their strong foundation, and finally showing the project in motion the following year at E3 2008, with a live demo narrated by Randy Pitchford a few years before he was the John DeLorean of video games, preserved in stunning HD through a grainy camcorder pointed at the projector.
And Borderlands is pretty neat. It takes place on the planet Pandora.
A lot of what's seen here is surprisingly similar to the finished game. Despite Pitchford stating that this was technically pre-alpha, it was only very recently delayed out of 2008, and it does seem very far along. It's also worth noting that this isn't the same demo shown off in Leipzig a year ago, despite its similar co-op quests with Roland and Mordecai. Having said that, it's clear that Borderlands is in flux here, and lacking some polish. Shooting looks like it feels really sluggish, and while things like 500,000 guns are still here, this doesn't feel like the series we know and love. Action skills are noticeably missing, a lot of the RPG elements which are swapped out at a terminal rather than in the echo menu feel incremental, and while there are more cutscenes, none of them have any real energy. That sentiment of this being a poor man's rage really does ring true here. Some of that could be chalked up to this still being a ways off, but it's not hard to see it launching in a similar state and the game feeling unfocused and a bit mediocre. To speak plainly, however, I vividly remember watching this demo on YouTube in early 2009 or so. While I wouldn't subscribe to Game Informer until 2010, ironically when I'd buy Borderlands used after months of renting it, this was right at the start of me following video games in this generation, as we had just got our 360 and a cable package that included G4. I try not to inject nostalgia often here, but what a year. For that demo, however, I remember trying desperately to describe seeing that many guns to a friend while not knowing the phrase procedural generation, and honestly not really noticing that the art style would change a few months later. I was more than anything just excited to blow bad guys in half. Despite the buzz around E3, however, the sentiment internally wasn't super positive. The team knew they had a good game, maybe even a great one, but something felt off. The tone in particular was sort of inconsistent. Players could jump high, play with all of these guns that shot lightning bolts or whatever, but the world, the gritty idea of a neglected planet wasteland, and the grays and browns it shared with its contemporaries all seemed to clash until the game felt confused. It didn't help that as development continued, more and more role-playing and apocalyptic adjacent shooters would pop up, with the likes of BioShock for the former, Rage for the latter, and Fallout 3 for both. In marketing, there's this idea of a purple cow from Seth Godin. This idea of giving a product something that separates it from the sea of black and white cows and gets people talking. While development was humming along, art director Brian Martell started thinking about Borderlands' purple cow. He and a few artists started a little mutinous experiment, developing a new art style in secret. When Randy Pitchford got word, he wasn't convinced, was more frustrated that they were taking time away from finishing the game to do whatever this was, but decided to give a small team 3 weeks to put together a presentation. What Martell cooked up was based around bringing those original concept art designs of Ron Cobb and beyond to life, recapturing the energy and excitement they felt when first looking at what Borderlands was going to be. It was a delicate balancing act. It had to be doable in a short time frame, but striking enough to justify the extra work and potential delay, all while not absolutely tanking morale from the team who would have to redo all of this work. They also didn't want to go too far or too weird and reuse as much as they could. When their 3 weeks were up, the art team would present a reworked Firestone to Pitchford, who was already dead set on shooting them down. However, when the results proved impressive, he had no choice but to say yes. A lot has been said about Borderlands' new look. I personally have always found it more reminiscent of Jamie Hewlett's work. The General Knox DLC has always reminded me of the endless highways of Gorillaz' 19-2000 music video, and Moses' design in Borderlands 3 is obviously influenced by Tank Girl. However, Borderlands' inspirations are a bit more good artist copy, great artist steal. At some point in 2008, before the redesign would be underway, someone at Gearbox would reach out to Ben Hibon of Stateless Films to assist with directing a new batch of cutscenes. Hibon had previously worked on the cinematics for Killer 7 back in 2005, and would go on to do the iconic Deathly Hallows animation a few years later. But most interestingly, had developed a short film for the MTV Music Awards in Asia named Code Hunters.
Gearbox saw my work and decided to reproduce it, make it their own, without my help or my consent. The hardest part for me when this happened was understanding why they wouldn't ask me directly. We were already talking about doing some work together. It made no sense.
The similarities between Borderlands' new look and Code Hunters are hard to deny, with the trademark concept art come to life style on full display, albeit in a slightly less colorful way. It's surprisingly egregious, and Pitchford's statement after the fact isn't much better, comparing it to The Incredibles' influence on Team Fortress, which to me at least feels thin. I am a little curious about the exact logistics of this. Did Martell reach out during that 3-week gap to get Hibon's help after seeing Code Hunters? Were they discussing bringing in Hibon to fix the cutscenes in the realistic version, saw Code Hunters in his portfolio and went from there? Or were they inspired by him, changed the art style, and wanted to bring him in for the new cutscenes? I don't want to point fingers or anything, but with this being started with a smallish team internally, it's hard to not feel that the buck stops at Martell. That being said, the experiment internally was a success. The team was renewed and everyone wanted to get their hands on this new art style, even despite the extra work needed to make their end of 2009 release date. Suddenly, that high jump distance and wacky weapons felt like they fit, and the door was open to go even further. As far as I can tell, this is where things like action skills and characters like Brick are added to the game. with the skill trees getting a much needed revamp to include things that weren't just plus 10 critical damage or whatever, and instead turn it into things like friendly fire healing allies or changing the effects of phase walk. Newer team members like writer Mikey Newman as well would revamp what they could of the story, quests, and incidental dialogue to lighten the tone, and turn Borderlands from a game that took place in, quote, the armpit of hell to a fun, light romp through a colorful version of hell. With their reveal the following year and showing it off at the next E3, Borderlands was now a hot commodity on the showroom floor. Everyone was talking about the purple cow. Upon release, the game was a success, a colorful Diablo Halo-like when first-person shooters were at an all-time high and RPGs were just breaking out on home consoles. Looking at it through the lens of its last-second changes and comparing it to those original demos and cover stories shows a game that feels obviously reshuffled. Original designs for Lilith, Mordecai, and Roland would be reused for Commandant Steele, Reaver, and either General Knox or Dr. Zed, depending on who you ask, respectively. And many of the guns and vehicles are only changed slightly to include the heavy outline. But the cuts are also obvious. Characters like Helena Pierce are diluted from being the narrator to just another in a long line of main story quest givers, and the story itself was met with criticism for being mostly non-existent, despite its heavy focus early on. It's an interesting contrast, and feels mostly like a product of it being a game that spent most of its time in development with an entirely different feel. It's not until the DLCs, and most prominently Borderlands 2, that the series refines its flashy over-the-top shooting and lighter tone to truly make something that feels congruent. That being said, there's something really special to me about Borderlands 1. The formula is so simple and pure and unpretentious, allowing for a player like me to play endless hours in 2010 or so after school, trudging my way to the vault while playing Them Crooked Vultures off a USB stick jammed into the front of my 360. Shoot some guys, do some quests, video game junk food. Borderlands would go on to be Gearbox's flagship franchise, garnering 3 main series sequels, 4-ish spin-offs, and a movie that may be covered on this channel one day if I can ever get through it without wanting to feed my eyeballs to skags.
What? I'm expelling the excess lead.
Rage, for what it's worth, would completely revamp its look and feel for its sequel in 2019, becoming more over the top and more looter-shootery in a way that feels distinctly Borderlands. I don't want to lean all of the creation of looter shooters on Gearbox alone. Enough developers described it as their dream game for it to feel unlikely that the same idea wasn't brewing in a similar form somewhere else. But the impact is hard to deny. That being said, it's not hard to see this going differently. I say game development is messy a lot here, but I think Borderlands 1 is one example of that messiness, the risk or what have you paying off. Without that art style change, Borderlands might have been good, great even, but I doubt it would have been talked about in the same way as often. It could have easily just been a poor man's Rage.